Hello, and welcome back to Zenin Fanfics. Today we're starting part 34 of an exciting new series. What if Villain Deku became a teacher at U.A? If you enjoy this video, please like and subscribe for more content. The story we're featuring is written by Bill on fanfiction.net. You can find all the relevant links in the description, so be sure to check out the author's profile and say hello. Now let's dive into the story. Mitsuki stood in her kitchen leaning against the counter deep in thought, only moving when the kettle she placed on the stove started to whistle, and even then her body was moving more on its own from muscle memory. Taking out a mug, she prepared a cup of tea for herself, absent-mindedly stirring her cup. Mitsuki's mind, as it had for the past couple of days, wandered back over the events of last Saturday. It was safe to say that Mitsuki's heart just about fell out of her, but when Masa came to get her during a photo shoot and told her that Katsuki had gotten into a fight at school, it was something she knew was more than likely to happen, but after managing to somehow scrape by for so long without anything happening, she had selfishly hoped things weren't going to escalate to that. Of course, they dropped everything and drove down to the school to talk with the principal. It didn't help her heart when they saw both of Tokoyami's moms were also just arriving and learning that both boys were likely a part of the same fight. Katsuki clearly adored having the two kids around since he was constantly inviting them over and talking with them on the phone, and if they got hurt because of him, Katsuki would probably never forgive himself over it. When she saw all three sitting by the office unharmed, she could have passed out from how relieved she was. And if they weren't here because of a fight, she would probably be internally squealing over the three of them cuddling like they were. Before she could so much as get out a word, though, the assistant principal stood from her desk and greeted them, something that shocked the kids, and the three of them leapt apart, pretending they weren't sitting together as they were. Both boys looking for all the world like a pair of guilty teens, which he supposed they were in hindsight. Aditi only managed to hug her son before the assistant principal ushered the whole lot of them into the office with the principal. It was a bit cramped in the office with 7 people, but there were more important things to focus on at the time. And as the principal explained it, both boys were at fault for not only fighting but using their quirks, 2 very big rules that were broken and definitely would need to be addressed with proper punishment. However, where things fell apart was when the principal tried to explain what had caused the fight to begin with after Aditi's wife asked. Because almost immediately once the principal started to speak, Tokoyami's feathers became ruffled, and he spat out, "That's not what happened. Bakugo was trying to protect me." Masa was the only one of the 3 of them that reacted well to hearing those words. Her head whipped over to gawk at him, slightly horrified, while Katsuki clenched his fists very tightly, while keeping his eyes locked on his lap. To be fair to them, though, they had heard those words repeatedly from little Izuku, and knowing the truth about them had her going on a mini spiral of if she had missed Katsuki backsliding. Mitsuki was so glad Masa had the patience of a saint, because their family well needed it to survive. "Tokoyami-kun, would you please explain what you mean by that?" Masa requested. "One of the upperclassmen that locked me in a closet had me pinned to the lockers, and that was why Bakugo attacked him," the boy explained before guiltily looking away, "and he was in the middle of a fit, so I used Dark Shadow to restrain him after breaking a fire extinguisher," he continued to tell them. And that caused a whole new tone to overtake the room as both of his moms began questioning the principal about this, because that was a key thing to leave out. A point that she very much agreed with, and ended up with them demanding to see the footage from the event since they knew that the school had cameras. It was a selling point of the school after all, and they had every right to see it. And sure enough, there was this punk that Tokoyami ran into who had the gall to slam him into the lockers by his neck and being very aggressive with him before Katsuki rather violently intervened. So, the meeting went south from there, with her and Aditi questioning why the boy that was being so antagonistic towards one of their sons wasn't also being punished for what he did in this debacle. By the end of it, both boys walked away with a 3-day suspension and a written warning on Katsuki's record, which Mitsuki did agree was warranted since Katsuki did assault another student, and both boys used their quirks outside of classes. But now that it was the next morning, Mitsuki found herself plagued with doubts and what-ifs. Should she have argued against the school punishment altogether, since Katsuki was only reacting to outside triggers and himself having a strong response to such situations? Or would she be going too soft on Katsuki if she left it just at that? She knew what she would have wanted her parents to do in that situation, but would that only screw him on his recovery in the long run. Then there was the whole thing with the Tokoyamis. Katsuki had made a lot of very offensive comments to their son on the footage, and if they didn't want Katsuki around their son anymore afterwards, she really couldn't blame them for it. It was almost impressive how quirkish Katsuki's mouth became during a fit. But God, them cutting ties would F Katsuki up so bad, and she wasn't even sure how she'd even approach that problem if it really came down to that. Mitsuki put her cup down and threw her head back with a groan, covering her eyes with her hands as her fingers dug into her hairline in some vain attempt to drag her mind away from the topic. Mitsuki startled when a pair of arms slipped around her waist only to calm down a second before she would have started hitting when she realized it was just Masa hugging her from behind, half asleep like he always was in the mornings before he had his tea. Looking over her shoulder, Mitsuki couldn't help a small smile when he proceeded to nuzzle her face, rubbing their noses together, muttering about the wackiest SHD she'd ever heard in her life. Having the pleasure of seeing exactly what Masa was like in the morning every day for over a decade, now she still couldn't believe how absurd her husband could be when he wasn't fully awake. Not that she'd have him any other way. With how collected he usually was, it was so cute for him to be so ludicrous. Mitsuki gave him a quick peck on the lips before giving him her cup of tea. She hadn't put anything in it yet, and she could pour herself another one. No skin off her nose. Masa muttered a garbled thank you and pecked her forehead before taking a sip, the caffeine working its magic almost immediately, and Masa was much more awake and rubbed at one of his eyes as he yawned. Masa blinked a few times before his eyes found her, likely because he forgot his glasses. Then he leaned his head on hers and wrapped an arm around her. "Are you still thinking about yesterday?" Masa asked, and Mitsuki sighed, letting her arms fall limply at her sides. "Yeah," she admitted, leaning into his embrace. "Do you think we're not doing enough?" she asked back, getting a considering hum back. "Strong to know." He replied after a moment. "He's a teenager. He's still trying to figure out who he is, and I don't think we'll be able to ever really know how he'll react to anything." Masa told her, which didn't really help her with the knot that was forming inside her ribs. Masa hugged her closer. "I know you're worried. I am too. But the best thing we can do for him right now is to take each day step by step and cross whatever bridge we come to when we get to it," Masa said, trying to reassure her. Mitsuki nodded. "I know, just wish it didn't feel like such a kick to the teeth every time this CRP happens. God, parenting sucks, but..." she complained, getting a deep chuckle from Masa. Then Masa took his leave to grab his glasses, but not before he gave her another peck on the lips, leaving her to get started on breakfast prep. Quickly, Mitsuki glanced at the clock and saw she was up a bit earlier than usual, but not by much, and set to work on cooking the one thing Inky managed to teach her when they were living together. She sucked at cooking and was quite happy to leave it to her wonderful husband, but today she felt they needed to have some comfort food that morning, so she was going to make them all some waffles. Mitsuki once again managed to successfully make a batch of waffles without burning any of them too badly, though the kitchen counter was the main casualty and was a goddamn mess now. Internally groaning, Mitsuki shook her head and turned to leave the kitchen and get the cleaning supplies to start unmucking the counter, but froze when she nearly ran into Katsuki at the doorway, who looked to be equally startled to see her. Mitsuki thought, quickly stepping back to give the boy some room. She avoided Katsuki's eyes as a tense air immediately descended upon them. She hadn't even figured out if she was being unfair with him by letting the school's punishment stand as it was, so how could she know what to say to Katsuki right now? F it. Maybe she should just avoid bringing it up for now and just serve him a plate of waffles in. Katsuki suddenly said something derailing her thoughts. "What?" she questioned, since he barely spoke above a whisper. Katsuki was silent for a minute before hoarsely repeated himself, clearly having a great deal of trouble raising his voice. "Are you disappointed in me?" Mitsuki's breath was ripped out of her, swiftly following her heart once she heard his question. She whipped her head around to stare at her son, not even believing she heard him right at first, but then she saw him. The cockiness he normally sported was completely stripped from him, his hair laying limp without the usual care he gave it, and Katsuki's head was ducked, hiding his eyes from view. But she didn't need them to see how wrecked he looked. His entire person screamed it. Mitsuki, completely separated from her previous uncertainty, didn't even need to think about what she needed to do right now, and her body acted before she could think. She closed the distance between them and wrapped Katsuki in a tight, almost crushing hug. Hell no, she firmly told him, and judging by his flinch, Katsuki didn't expect a response at all. But I lost my SHD. I could have hurt them like I did Izuku, and Patchy F defended me like Dash. Katsuki started to protest, but she cut him off by pulling away and grabbing him by the shoulders, then forcing him to look her directly in the eye. Katsuki, she started to say, only to pause as she fumbled with her words as she realized that Katsuki must have tormented himself all night over this by the bags under his eyes. You F up, but this isn't like what happened last time, Mitsuki settled on saying. You lost your CRP, yeah, but that's going to happen when your brain is F up. I'm on meds, and I still lost my SHD over the pettiest things. I'd be the world's biggest hypocrite if I was disappointed you couldn't keep it together. Mitsuki told him, raising her hand to ruffle his hair. And if that had been me in that situation at your age, I definitely would have torn his head off. Hell, Inky's ripped teeth out of people for doing that SHD, so don't dog yourself with that. The F-er deserved to get his SHD rocked, she assured the boy. If anything, I'm proud of you for keeping a lid on your SHD the way you have, Mitsuki added, startling the boy as he stared up at her, his eyes wide in disbelief, and she couldn't help a huff of amusement. She booped him, I'm serious, Suki. Compared to how I was in middle school, you're a bona fide saint. You've only had 3 big fits since we've pulled you from the SHD hole, which is leagues better than where I was when Inky took me in, Mitsuki promised. Katsuki's mouth opened a bit, then he clenched his jaw as his tears began to well up. Before they could fall, though, Katsuki stubbornly buried his face in her chest and hugged her very tightly. Shut up, you overly emotional beach. Katsuki snapped back at her. Mitsuki blinked, then chuckled, hugging him back, and nuzzled the top of his head. Maybe when you ask politely, you ungrateful brat, she replied, closing her eyes. Blinking, Toshinori looked around himself before he sighed. Once again, he found himself in this empty house and shook his head. Toshi, the ghost of a memory, called for him, asking him, and he scowled at the only door of the room he was in. Please, Toshi. It pleaded with him, but he turned away from it and closed his eyes, once again willing himself to wake up. To Dash, Toshinori jolted awake, sitting up far too quickly, and he clutched his chest. He began coughing, and a few drops of BLD came out of his mouth before he managed to calm the fit. Swallowing dryly, Toshinori ran a hand through his hair and exhaled deeply, then buried his head in his hands. Ever since Torino-sensei had cornered him, he'd been having those dreams again. They had first started once he'd gotten his MSTR's quirk, though they'd changed quite a bit from his first ones. The ones when he floated in some void, but those were hazy even back then, and he could barely remember them now. But now they were very solid, almost lifelike, as he'd always open his eyes to his old apartment that he barely managed to afford when he had first met his MSTR, the previous tenant's kid scrawl on the walls and all. And outside the door, there would be someone calling to him, asking him to open the door, usually his MSTR pleading with him to open the door. A way to cope with losing her, most likely. It was nice to hear her voice in the beginning, even if it was simply an echo his mind created from twisted memories. Now, though, Nana's voice was nearly worn down as he felt. She'd only repeat his name and beg for him to answer her. The dream used to only haunt him once in a blue moon, but it seemed to happen every night now, which really wasn't helping him deal with anything like it used to. Having her pleading with him just made the hole in his chest feel like it was being reopened all over again, which wasn't ideal, but he could live with it. Some days, though, Toshinori missed the men that would ask him to come out of the apartment. He didn't know who they were for certain, but Toshinori suspected they were from some of the other people he couldn't save, but most of them didn't stick around long. Except for one guy that would take his MSDR's place once in a while, asking if he could be let in, though Toshinori had no idea why. Still, his voice was a welcome reprieve from Nanas. Pushing his dreams aside for now, Toshinori got to his feet and shuffled over to his bathroom, meeting his sunken eyes in the mirror before he opened it to get his medications from inside the cabinet. Swallowing them with a bit of difficulty, then he moved on to brush his teeth. Disregarding the pink foam he left in the sink, there was always a bit of BLD in the toothpaste at this point. Leaving for the kitchen, Toshinori decided he would shower once he got home from patrol today, and his hair would only get messed up again once he got out there. Looking through his fridge, Toshinori tried to decide between having 2 pink yogurts or 2 yellow ones with his morning shake. Not really caring, he grabbed one of each and sat down at his table to start eating them, the meal passing in all but a few minutes, and he took another pill with the meal. Despite the low maintenance of the morning, Toshinori couldn't help feeling utterly sapped of energy, and he allowed himself to rest his chin on his hands and close his eyes instead of immediately clearing away his mess. His thoughts traitorously turned back to Torino-sensei's words, and as much as he hated to admit it, Torino-sensei had a very good point. He was no match for all for one in his state. He was scrapping by with his day-to-day patrols as he was. And with how things were looking for him, he would only have 3 more years, 5 if he gave in and retired like everyone else seemed to insist that he do. Toshinori jumped when he heard his phone ding with a text. Surprised, he reached over for it, and he checked his messages, a smile being pulled from him as he saw a message from Melissa had come in. Sunflower chat. Melly. Good morning, Uncle Mike. Melly. Hugging pair of dogs gif. Melly. Hope you have a great day. Toshinori couldn't help feeling a tug of warmth from chest. Sunflower chat. Uncle. Shouldn't you be asleep, Melissa? Melly. Yees, but it's Sunday, Uncle. So I can stand to stay up an hour or so longer if I want. Melly. Besides, it's been way too long since we talked. Melly. And you haven't talked to Dad recently either. Melly. Oh. Speaking of. Melly. Shared a picture? Melly. Dad fell asleep at his desk again. Think I should wake him so he can go to bed. Toshinori dryly chuckled, texting a quick reply to her, apologizing for not being able to talk at the moment before setting his phone aside. David had been a very good friend to him, and he was glad David hadn't also joined the others in trying to get him to retire. Toshinori wasn't sure what he would do if David had also asked him to retire and stop being All Might. Toshinori clenched his fist as he stared at his hands, covered in calluses and nearly bone-thin. In a second, he could pour one for all into his veins, and they'd be filled with the power to move mountains and change the weather if he aimed it right. But that power would only last for a few hours, and if he kept losing weight as he wouldn't be able to call upon one for all for even a few seconds. At which point he'd be easy prey for all for one. Toshinori didn't fear he'd give one for all to that monster. He'd never planned to part with the quirk in the first place. But the monster was back. Glancing back at the photo Melissa had taken of herself, and David, Toshinori couldn't stop an awful type of dread from building in his guts. The thought of leaving the two of them, or Tsukauchi, to that monster's mercy was unthinkable. But at the same time, the idea of giving up one for all to anyone else, just Toshinori couldn't even think about it, much less consider it. But keeping it would mean dooming everyone. So as much as the idea of giving up All Might made him feel gutted once again, but he couldn't bring himself to be that selfish. However, if he was to pass one for all on, then he couldn't take such an endeavor without being careful with his choice of successor. He'd need to pick someone with the right mindset, naturally, but at the same time he'd need to keep in mind the fact that All for One was around and likely to make a move against them. Unfortunately, Toshinori didn't know anyone he would give one for all to that he felt could handle it. To be honest, his social circle wasn't that large. Tsukauchi was an honest man, but he was past his prime. Even if he started training now, he'd never gain enough muscle to use it or maintain his body, not to mention the stain of doing so while working as a detective. Both David and his daughter were also off the list, since they weren't a part of this mess in the beginning, and he certainly wouldn't drag either of them into it. Sasaki wasn't an option either. Even if they were on speaking terms, he was too old and had already dedicated himself to a figure that wouldn't work with the quirk either. Torino-sensei naturally couldn't be considered at all, nor Recovery Girl. And everyone else he knew was only as acquaintances through his hero work, so he couldn't accurately tell whether or not they would be the right person to give one for all, much less if they would be able to handle the pressure of it all. Toshinori sighed, wondering what he could possibly do to find someone that would be able to train up and the right mindset. The others all talked a big game about him finding a successor, but now that he was sitting down to find one, he was struggling to figure out how to narrow down his search, or even where to begin looking. Maybe he could ask someone for help, but who? Sasaki wouldn't speak with him, not after their blow-up. He wouldn't want to bother Tsukauchi, since he was constantly being pulled around to answer questions for different crimes. And Torino-sensei was a complete hermit and wouldn't know exactly where to find someone, but maybe a few things for him to narrow the search by. Speaking of, wasn't there someone that Torino-sensei insisted on him bringing before Nizu? If he meant Nizu as in the current principal of UA, then he sort of agreed with Torino-sensei that he would be useful to them, especially with his quirk. Nizu would certainly be helpful in finding a successor. But how to get in contact with Nizu? Toshinori wouldn't risk leaking his search for a successor, so he'd need to come up with another reason for why he would speak with the principal. He was getting up there in years. Perhaps he could visit him under the guise of applying for a teaching position. He wouldn't take one, of course. He would never risk the health of the kids by staying there long term, but it would be enough to get him in the door and speaking to Nizu. Another ding from his phone brought him out of his mind, and he saw it was text from Sakachi reminding him to eat more than a couple of yogurts before he went out for patrol. Toshinori shot the man a quick reply, and though he didn't feel hungry, moved over the fridge and pulled out one of the shakes and took a picture of it after he drank it for Sakachi's sake. His health wasn't the best, but Sakachi seemed to make it his personal mission to nag him over it. Yoichi watched on melancholically as Eighth's doorway faded away once again without it budging in the slightest. His brother had taken quite a toll on their most recent holder, and he couldn't help feeling especially bad for Seventh. No one's mind had been open to their shared space at first, but after a year, most had come around and at least were able to make their own space if they couldn't enter the common area. But Eighth, on the other hand, his doorway into their space had remained firmly shut and never once wavered despite their best attempts to convince Eighth to open it for them. Well, he and Nana were trying. The others long given up on Eighth as someone who'd only join them once he had passed on. And as much as he hated to say it, Yoichi understood where the others were coming from. Even Second wasn't nearly as stubborn as Eighth was. And Second was the first one to have their quirk, and when he himself had no clue what was going on, since he was dying in Second's arms 1 minute and trapped in this endless place the next. Eighth's denial of them was so strong that they couldn't even know Eighth's name, and Nana couldn't tell them it either. A fact of this new plane that Yoichi had not been able to understand beyond that it was a thing. He'd known Second personally, but he couldn't speak his name because Second refused to share it with the others. Walking over to Nana, Yoichi placed a hand on her shoulder, and she sighed softly, turning back to him and looking at him over her shoulder. There was still some hope in her that Eighth would respond to her even after all these years of silence. Yoichi knew that much from the look in her eyes. She didn't need to explain anything with words since after 50 years of being together Yoichi had come to fully understand her expressions, just as he had with every other holder. Come rest, Nana. You can try again once Eighth slumbers. I shall keep watch while you recover yourself. He encouraged. She frowned but exhaled, and she muttered, "Thank you, Yoichi," then wearily floated up and away to the large chrome bubble and went into it. It was quite interesting how his quirk crafted areas that truly reflected each holder. Turning his gaze back to the space where the door would reappear when Eighth fell asleep again, Yoichi settled down to sit on the pathway and waited. He hadn't the same connection with Eighth as Nana did, but understood her desperation to make contact with him. They knew that Eighth would be passing them on with how his body was deteriorating, and they wanted to make contact with him before that to warn him about being careful of his choice. The next person would need to be quirkless much like Eighth in order to not suffer from bearing their quirk. Well, this wasn't where Oswald thought he would be last week. But as he looked around at the room he was in, he couldn't say he was disappointed with it either. After Aizawa brought him to you, he had to sit down and explain things to a social worker about why he wanted to be a ward. Explaining how he constantly walked in on his dad and stepmother's private activities ever since the man moved her in, and Oswald only got up to the SHD that was going on when he was 10 before the very flustered woman told him to stop. To be fair to her, though he probably should have left out the details about the role plays they did once he clocked the crucifix necklace she wore, she likely hadn't even known half of the kinks he told her about existed before then. He'd apologized for scarring her, but it got him out of their custody, so he wasn't that sorry about it. Then there was the paperwork that needed to be signed, which meant his bio dad would have to file a court case to get custody of him back and work out whom he was going to stay with. Aizawa and the social worker discussed with Nizu about who the best guardian for him would be, Aizawa making sure he was consulted the entire time, like his longing to not be with a foster family and preferring to live with a teacher if he could. In the end, he ended up being temporarily placed with MSTR Sensei until they worked out more of the details of his case. And now he was going to be staying with Mstr-sensei in the man's really nice apartment, which was underselling the place to call it an apartment. It was more like a penthouse with the open floor plan, living room bigger than the classroom, and a second floor where the bedrooms were located. Speaking of which, Oswald sat up from his new bed and looked around his room. It was a decent size. He had a nice desk and a tall but bookshelf that might be taller than their mini Zilla, and a big but balcony if he ever wanted to step outside for a minute he could. Then there was the bed. Oswald wasn't sure if the beach just had sucky taste in mattresses or something like that, but his new bed was really the SHD. Like he's never melted before, but he was super tempted to turn into a puddle in his bed to stay there for a bit longer. And then there were the sheets and blankets, which were the fluffy kind that you could snuggle with, which increasingly made him want to melt more in them. Alas, he could not do that, and instead settled for turning around to lay on his belly, rubbing his cheek lazily against the softness. A grumble from his stomach, however, forced him to abandon his den and go back to the main area for some food. Glancing around, he caught Mstr-sensei sitting at the kitchen with a cat mug sipping something in his pajamas, which made him stop and stare at the blonde. Mainly because out of everything the man could where Oswald wouldn't have pegged Mstr-sensei as a cat onesie sort of man. Like Oswald couldn't judge, but seeing one of his teachers in a demon onesie was not what he expected to see, like ever. Mstr-sensei raised his head somewhat towards him, mourning Oswald and, "Do you want some breakfast?" Mstr-sensei offered. Oswald hemmed and hawed, considering whether or not to make himself something to eat before ultimately deciding to be lazy and had whatever his homeroom teacher was having. Then Oswald nodded his head. "All right, the steamer will be done in a couple of minutes," Mstr-sensei said, motioning to the vegetable steamer that was indeed cooking away with his head. Oswald hummed in acknowledgement and settled down on a stool at the kitchen, all much like his teacher had, and started to go through his messages to see if anyone other than Minizilla was up yet. Hato, the ball of energy she was, certainly would, but he was kind of hoping that it would be one of the mornings where Jiki would also be up. The boy was worried about him not showing up to school the past couple of days, which were spent settling in at Mstr-sensei's place despite him wanting to go back since yesterday. So he'd been left to go crazy from early onset cabin fever inside the apartment. "Oswald-kun," Sensei called, and he turned to face the blond man with a raised brow. "I know you don't like being cooped up here. How would you feel about going out to get some stuff for your room after school today?" her sensei suggested. Oswald blinked a bit surprised. He'd probably be moving out in a year or so once he turned 18. Maybe he'd stay until graduation, but he couldn't see being allowed to stay much longer than that. So he wasn't sure why Mstr-sensei would encourage him to get a bunch of stuff when he would be around for that long in the end. But if the man was going to pay for his things, then Oswald wasn't going to argue that much about it. If nothing else, he'd just get some of the stuff he'd need once he was on his own, and depending on the place they went, he might be able to get something for the others. "Well, I guess I wouldn't mind. Can my friends come?" Oswald asked. Sensei hummed consideringly. "I suppose, as long as you all stay within sight, and together I wouldn't mind," Sensei answered, propping his head in one of his hands. "Cool. I'm going to text them to see who'll come," Oswald replied, turning back to his phone. Cannibal Crew laughing face. The victim. "Hey guys, the warden's going to let me out for a bit to do some shopping after school. Let's out. Any of you all coming?" Enthusiastic Cannibal. "Are you kidding? Of course I'm going." Enthusiastic Cannibal. "Do you know where we going?" The victim. "Nah, didn't ask where. Probably somewhere that has a bunch of home decor that you don't need, but we'll buy anyway." Enthusiastic Cannibal. "Got it. I'll make sure to bring my wallet." Casual Cannibal. "I wouldn't mind coming." Enthusiastic Cannibal. "Yay." Main Cannibal. Mirio. "Won't be able to come because he has an appointment with a costume designer, but I, don't have anything to do." The victim. "Don't worry. We'll have NR around to keep us from going completely batshit Jiki." Main Cannibal. "Okay." The victim. "Don't force yourself to come along, Jiki. I'll send the Maneater and Mini Zilla over with some trinkets and SHD. Casual Cannibal. "He's right. You can just tell us what to keep an eye out for while we're shopping." Enthusiastic Cannibal. Nodding GIF. Oswald smiled, then turned back to Sensei. "So Miyake and Hato are going. Amajiki is on the fence. Heya is probably still asleep, and Togata has an appointment," he told the man. "All right, I'll make sure to wait by the entrance for them." Sensei. commented. Then the steamer beeped very loudly to get their attention, and Deku-Sensei stood to get them both a bowl. Many hours later, Oswald, along with his friends, were subject to watching as Hato was pleading with what looked like her mother. Said woman, however, wasn't budging and merely grabbed her by the ear. Apologizes for any inconvenience this might cause you, but Nijire won't be able to join you. She has a dentist appointment today, the silver-haired woman told them. Oh, bacon. Hato whined as the woman began dragging her away from them. He, Minizilla, Heya, and Jiki stood there watching as the pair went in silence, with it broken a moment later by Minizilla's thrill. I suppose Hato won't be joining us after all, the tall boy said. Think we should get her something? Heya asked. Yeah, we'll stop by a mutation shop either way. We need to get me some star bins and bio bags. Oswald answered with a shrug. Miyake blinked and tilted his head, clearly not the only one confused by him saying the term, and before Miyake spoke up though Heya did, you need to get star bins. Even though your cast-offs are taffy. Technically, yeah, I fall under starfish laws. My body's taffy, but it's malleable and can stretch, so the bigger parts have to be disposed of. I count as an editable, so I have the option to donate them, but if I can't, then I have to put them in a star bin or a bio bag for the smaller parts. Oswald explained. Oh, I guess I can see that. Heya conceded with a nod. Before they could talk more about it, Mr. Sensei had returned with a pair of keys. I've got Nisa's permission to borrow one of the cars. Where is Hato? Mr. Sensei inquired. She had dentist appointment, our sensei, and her grandmother picked her up. Minizilla answered. Grandma? Heya repeated, surprised, and frankly he was with her on that one. The woman that picked her up looked pretty young to be her mom, so he didn't know how he got grandma out of that. Their relation was more distant than mother and daughter. They smelt like grandmother and grandchild, he elaborated, making a show of flicking his blue tongue out of them. Ah, Heya replied. Right. Will you be coming to us, Amajiki, or should we drop you off at home first? Sir Sensei asked. Jiki, who'd been rather quiet this whole time, flinched once everyone was looking at him and began fiddling with his sleeve. Minizilla offered up his tail. Jiki ducked his head as he took hold of it and swallowed. I'm going with. Jiki said, avoided their eyes. Oswald smiled and leaned against Jiki cool. He said, moving some tendrils of hair around so that it covered Jiki's face, making the boy squeak. After confirming who was or wasn't going, they all went to the private parking lot, where they piled into a large truck that had a back part big enough for Minizilla to comfortably sit in. Then they were off, and it didn't take them long to arrive at a strip mall. Something that was a problem they didn't realize they would have until they stood at the entrance of the grand building. Oswald's stomach flipped, and he swallowed, thickly standing at the threshold. Well, looks like Inu wasn't pulling his leg about unexpected triggers, because currently speaking, Oswald wanted nothing more than to turn back around and F off in the face of another mall. A tug on his sleeve brought his eyes to find Jiki, the guy trembling as he worriedly looked up to him from his side. Oswald huffed, his shoulders slumped, and he gave him a small smile. I'll be fine, Jiki, just some nerves, he assured, leaning against the other boy. Jiki jumped a bit, but didn't move away like always, but moved to lean into it oddly enough. Oswald was caught off guard at first, but clocked that Jiki was trembling less now, and it was only then did it occur to him that Jiki might not be stressing out just from being in a crowded and loud place. If Oswald ever got the chance, he'd punch the villains that attacked them all in the groin for making Jiki's already high levels of anxiety worse than they usually were. Pushing his imaginary revenge to the side, Oswald refocused on Jiki, and he reached down to take Jiki's hand in his. Come on, Jiki. Let's go in and find some CRP for my room at Sensei's, he muttered, squeezing his hand a bit tighter. Jiki bit his lip and squeezed his hand back before he buried his face in Oswald's shoulder. Oh, Jiki quietly replied. Steeling himself, Oswald started to walk forward with Jiki in tow and entered the mall, the brisk air conditioning hitting his face like a slap, but he didn't allow himself to falter because Jiki needed him to be strong at the moment. Which was exactly why Oswald made a beeline for the beauty shop he spotted in the corner. I haven't been able to make that eye patch for the mini BJ yet. Help me pick a color, Jiki. Do you think glittery pink or a gouge your eyes out neon tie-dye would give the real BJ a slide? He asked while leading Jiki over to the rows of nail polish. Yuri left the building with a frown. Valentine, who was following not far behind him, offered him a pack of cigarettes. Yuri plucked one from the box and lit up as he stepped into the car. Yuri took a long drag before he breathed out as Valentine got behind the wheel and drove off. "How is he?" Yuri questioned. "He's working with one of his students' quirks at the moment. They're floating at the moment according to the Vespas. Seems to be having fun," Valentine answered, passing a folder back to his boss. And during the conference, Yuri pressed opening the file, pictures of his and a young girl floating and laughing together in the photos. A smile curling on his face as he went through them. He handled the questions far better than we expected, bared his fangs once or twice when they hit a sore spot. Valentine replied as Yuri got to the flash drive in the folder. Frost crept up the seat. "Which sore spots?" Yuri inquired with a frown. Valentine paused before he asked, "Well, one woman implied that it was their job to police the students' morals, and said woman also questioned his ability to judge who should be heroes." He answered, making the frost in the back worse. "Did they catch the woman's name and company?" Yuri questioned. "Yes, I've already instructed our people to drop all of our shares in the paper, and the Vespas will likely have a complete file on all of the blackmail we can use on your desk once we get back to the house." Valentine replied. "Did anyone else question my?" Yuri asked, closing the file and putting it aside so he didn't ruin the pictures inside. One man turned the conference around so that they were focused on the prank instead of, Valentine told him. "Who does he work for?" Yuri inquired, easing up some. "He was there on behalf of Asahi, but he's a freelancer, so we can't reward him the traditional way." Valentine answered, and Yuri huffed. "Shame." Yuri commented, "What about the meta member? How did she act during the conference?" Yuri questioned, drumming his fingers on his leg. "She remained silent and didn't move to approach Yuri, but he went out of his way to get a moment alone with her and made his boundaries with their group clear after he returned what the Vespas took from her." Valentine said. Yuri smirked at that. "Good. I don't want them anywhere near him if it can be helped." Yuri commented as he thought of the modern face of the Meta Liberation Army. Chikara would have been sorely disappointed and disgusted with the way people have twisted his words. Yuri hadn't had the pleasure of knowing the man that well, but they had met a couple of times, the young man asking for his help with fighting against the government that wanted to use them like dogs. They had a bond of sorts from spending so long fighting the oppressive government regimes of the time. He even had one of the original copies of the man's book since Chikara was worried about people taking him out of context. A very reasonable fear considering the zealots that changed his book structure so that his greatest fear was the goal of the crazier groups like in Japan. Yuri never allowed the alternate copies made by people to sell more books to be put on shelves in Russia. It wasn't much, but he could do that much for a man that also fought for their freedom and died for it. The cryptocracy they were pushing for was absolutely the antithesis of what he wanted. It was Chikara's greatest fear that they would use him as a reason to attack others and an excuse to make the quirkless suffer unnecessarily for their ancestors' actions against them. And with the slaughter of 2,297, he had to admit that Chikara had good reason to be afraid of such things. Yuri only wished that those disgusting bigots hadn't further sullied the name of Chikara's movement with their actions. He could only comfort himself in the fact he paid for the mass graves needed for the victims, and that the people behind the violence hadn't lived for much longer after the fact. Yuri scowled, groaning as he pinched the bridge of his nose, hating to even give those scum even the slightest amount of acknowledgement. "Valentine, take me to the nearest bar I can go to," Yuri ordered, letting his head fall back. "Of course, sir. It will only be 10 minutes. Valentine promised. As Valentine said, they arrived at one of the places he drank at often. It was in the business district and one of the nicer places that wasn't explicitly under his control, but also not fully neutral either. Yuri walked inside and left his jacket with Valentine. The man could drop it off after he talked with the valet about the car. He wasn't impressed by the ritzy air the place was going for, the gleaming metal and jewels having long lost their luster back during his second century of life. At least it was a touch more tasteful than some places he had been to. Looking over the tables with a few people there discussing business, he focused on finding the bar and ordering a drink. Spotting it after a moment, and he almost as quickly clocked someone he hadn't expected to see there. Kuryagitan, the MLA's very own Iceman, was sitting at the bar wearing what was clearly a work suit. Though the top part was unbuttoned, his tie was loosened and his hair was let down. He was the one that was trying to poach from the cult. to aid in his plans to tear down the #2 hero that played a part in his daughter and granddaughter's demise. Well, Geaton did work for a company that was well off enough to send the man here on business, but that hardly explained his demure look currently. Perhaps a business deal gone bad. No, he would not have stuck around in the restaurant then. His wouldn't stand for him meddling, but as important as the man was to his plans, Yuri would like to get a personal feel for the man himself. So, Yuri walked over to the bar and settled himself on a stool next to Kiryu. The man's pale blue eyes flickered over to him, but then returned the plastic cup of alcohol he was nursing with small sips. "What can I get you?" the bartender asked. Yuri slid his card discreetly over to her, since Kiryu hadn't seemed to recognize him. "Vodka if you have any, white rice sake if not. Warm it up and put it in plastic." He requested, getting a raised eye, since warming liquor wasn't a normal longing. But once she looked at his card, she quickly nodded, saying a quick, "Right away, sir," before leaving to get what he wanted. "Should try a salt liquor," Kiryu suddenly said, and Yuri raised an eye at him. The salt is a bit of a turn-off taste-wise, but it keeps the alcohol from freezing as fast. Kiryu elaborated, "Though you should stick to harder liquor if you try it. Dulls the salt's kick," he added a second later. Yuri hummed. "I shall keep that in mind, Mr. Yuri," said, offering his hand, putting on a bit of an accent. "Can just call me Jin," Kiryu told him, shaking his hand. "You," the other Ice Quirk user asked in return. "Yuri," he gave, knowing it was a common enough name the buzzed man wouldn't immediately connect the dots if he still hadn't yet. The bartender returned with a cup appropriate for his size, and he quietly motioned for her to scram, while Kiryu took another sip and was distracted. Alone for the moment, Yuri gave his drinking partner another look over now that he was up close. And the other man did seem troubled by something, though just what exactly was up for debate. So, since Kiryu had so generously started a line for dialogue, Yuri would be more than happy to take advantage of that. "Things at work causing problems?" Yuri innocently inquired before taking a sip from his cup. Kiryu scoffed, "Could say that, but ain't nothing I wasn't prepared for. SHD with my family." On the other hand, Kiryu trailed off, shooting him a look, clearly contemplating on whether or not drunkenly rambling to a complete stranger was something he wanted to do. Yuri could respect that hesitance, but he wanted to know what was on the man's mind and pressed. "My company is based in Russia," he mentioned, leaving out the fact he had all but moved to Japan at the moment, and let him think that he wasn't going to be around for much longer. Even then, Kiryu seemed to be very reluctant to speak to him, but broke down after another moment. "I've recently reconnected with my nephew," Kiryu begrudgingly admitted, swirling his cup. Yuri blinked at that, taking a second to remember why Kiryu was important to his plans. The oldest Todoroki's son must have been the one Kiryu was referring to. "And there are some growing pains between you," Yuri guessed. "Yep," Kiryu confirmed, then he sighed, putting his head in his hands. "And I have no idea what to do about it," he muttered. Yuri hummed in acknowledgement. In a way, he could sympathize with the young man. It wasn't quite the same between him and Anya, but when she called him after so long, he certainly felt a tension in the air that made talking once again difficult. Connecting with a family member of whom you've never personally met before would take a difficult toll on someone. Similar past between the two young men notwithstanding. Yuri internally huffed, bemused by how many people his collected, people that had bad relationships with their parents, especially those closer to his inner circle. Turning back to the other man, Yuri tilted his head. "Would you like a few words of wisdom from a stranger?" Yuri offered, leaning forward onto his arms onto the bar's countertop. Kiryu blinked and then gave a soft scoff of disbelief. "You know what? Sure. I'd love to hear what you'd say. Can't be worse than what my co-workers would tell me if I asked them," Kiryu said, grumbling the last part under his breath. Yuri gave the man a kind smile. "Take some time to speak with him. Not about anything of major importance, but that stuck out either way. Pay attention to the smaller things, and every once in a while give him something of yourself," Yuri told the young man. "Maybe start with giving him your number without asking for his, so that he can contact you on his own terms, without any pressure," Yuri added with less vagueness. "One of the worst things you could do in this situation is to not show enough interest in building or maintaining a relationship with them. And alternatively, you can't force them to do more than they want to do." Yuri further elaborated. "If you're a constant and stable presence, then he'll be more willing to come to you because of that. My daughter certainly could have used a bit more of that before she passed." Yuri told him as one last part before he downed the rest of his drink. Kiryu smiled back. Though it wasn't as nice, since it was tipped with bitterness, I probably could have used someone like that too. Kiryu commented. Yuri stood up from his seat and placed his hands in his pockets, as would I when I was younger. You'll figure it out though, Jin, Yuri said before turning away and heading for the other end of the bar where the bartender was. I'd like my card back now, oh. Yuri glanced back to Kiryu. Add whatever the young man gets to my bill. Yuri instructed the woman as he wrote down his name on the bill before taking his card and leaving. Valentine waiting for him there. A good drink, sir? Valentine asked, falling in step with Yuri once again. Yuri hummed, in a manner of speaking. Yuri answered. Kiryu wasn't fully out of the cult's mindset, but his had certainty made quite a crack in the indoctrination, and there was a spark of the man the boy could be. How long would it take to make a sales position in one of our branches here, Valentine? Yuri questioned. His wouldn't approve of his meddling, but further getting him away from the cult would only help get the young man away from those people, especially since there would be backlash from the cult who likely got him his current job. Mirai pursed his lips as he closed the tab on his laptop and contemplated everything he'd seen of Midoriya during UA's conference and compared it to the boy's previous behavior. From what he could tell, Midoriya was starting to let his mask slip, perhaps feeling more comfortable now that he had Nizu and UA's protection behind him, though the boy was still being cautious and didn't completely let go of his facade. No, because Midoriya would still need to play up the part of being a young boy simply doing the right thing. And Mirai had to give it to Midoriya. He lived up to the act very well for the most part. Born to a nice enough couple with an upper-middle-class income combined, even though the lovely couple divorced when he was 5, and they just had to live on his mother's still generous enough pay to stay in their cozy apartment. His schooling records were the only thing that hinted to the boy's darker side. The one that showed he was as jealous and petty of a boy like his grandfather, though he still wasn't sure on which side All for One was related to, since he couldn't poke any holes in the grandparents he found on file. Perhaps the relation between Midoriya and All for One was more distant than grandparents, but they couldn't be that far apart genetically since Midoriya was quirkless. A fact that was easier to believe would happen since All for One was almost certainly the first with the quirk gene in his family line, bar his brother, compared to the 6 generations on both sides the flies would have them believe. And as the medical record stated, Midoriya was quirkless. The x-rays he managed to get a hold of were accurate and not quite identical to any of the other ones he could scrounge up, so Mirai was more inclined to believe the fact he was born that way. Being given a quirk likely didn't change the bone structure of the person given said quirk from what they could tell of the few people they had found that had their quirks taken from them, bar any quirk-based mutations. It was highly possible that Midoriya had a secret quirk, or multiple ones from All for One that wouldn't be found without a gene trace, something that hadn't been given to Midoriya at any point. What a coincidence! Mirai scoffed. Nothing about that boy was a coincidence. The paranoia and actions of Midoriya didn't speak of an innocent mind, much less that of a preteen. Mirai was quite sure Midoriya was given advice about how to proceed in his endeavors without being caught from All for One. Why else would Midoriya begin his work in the South Side, one of the easiest places to hide his illegal actions, which the boy most certainly had? Mirai had reviewed the footage of Midoriya's first interview, and it was a joke. The boy had run mental circles around Nizu and Sakachi, getting them both to go along with talking about what Midoriya wished to discuss, and not let them ask the more important questions, such as his real relationship with All for One. Sure, the boy's answers implied he was hiding from the man, but not once did he directly say he was one of the many quirkless hiding from All for One, or that he himself was being hunted by All for One. The fact was Midoriya never once said it was something that he personally feared, and Mirai couldn't believe that something so big had slipped past both Nizu and Sakachi. Using the trauma of the Inferno at the South Side to throw both Sakachi and Nizu off kilter had been a very effective ploy of Midoriya's, and all the while building himself up as a good person for being there to aid the people simply out of the kindness of his heart. Mirai scoffed again, rolling his eyes this time, and moved over to his filing cabinet to pull out all the connections Midoriya was confirmed to have. The Vespas, an Italian mob family that had a chokehold over the largest information network seen on the planet and dealt with far more than just information. The Russian Vipers were of a similar size and were nearly as old as quirks themselves, a mafia that basically worked hand in hand with Russia's large government bodies, though that was normally kept very quiet outside of the country. The South Side was all but in Midoriya's pocket, as were the groups that lived there under the umbrella of protection that comes from the lack of oversight from the proper authorities. Not to mention the dozens of smaller gangs, and even a few of the leftover Yakuza members from Toshinori's dismantling of them had joined under Midoriya's banner, under one of the only groups they hadn't taken out, the Nightcrawlers. And Midoriya just so happened to have relationships with all of these important and influential criminal groups by chance. It had as much chance, as was Mirai's selection, as Toshinori's one and only sidekick being completely random and not at all affected by him pestering Toshinori for months. No, Midoriya had to be building himself a network of his own, one that wasn't that different from All for One's, if he recalled. All for One's network was formed via goodwill in the beginning. As well, preying upon his fellow quirk people into believing him to be some sort of messiah, a god like being able to take away their curse or give them the power to defend themselves. Midoriya, however, wasn't able to give quirks as candy like All for One, so he aimed for a niche that gave him the control that All for One hadn't capitalized on yet, though it was in the same vein of manipulation as All for One's with the quirks. Instead, Midoriya preyed on people by making them indebted to him, by offering them everything else a person needed to survive. Gave them food, water, shelter, and protection from the dangers they surrounded themselves with, making them feel indebted to Midoriya for their continued survival. Even his making them independent was further playing into the manipulation Midoriya was doing, because those he uplifted would still feel indebted to him, but would have even more to give back to Midoriya, and in turn extend his reach in addition to the boy's power. And all of this maneuvering masquerading as the altruism of a young boy that just wanted to do right by others. All for One truly taught that boy well, though Midoriya's old man would have many years to perfect the many ways to make people bend to his will, willingly or not. A skill that Midoriya had picked up with zeal, considering that he was able to worm his way into Nizu's pocket within weeks of the two of them meeting. How else would the mammal not realize the deviousness of the boy? In any other circumstance, Nizu's quirk would have helped him understand the underlying nature of the boy's actions, and helped them neutralize Midoriya, as the threat he was instead of protecting him. Mirai placed the folder of Midoriya's connections back and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He understood that by going after Midoriya, he'd be mostly on his own. He wasn't dumb enough to think that All for One didn't have some heroes under his influence, whether they knew it or not. Nor would anyone call him a saint for persecuting a boy most people would still consider a child regardless of the law. But most people didn't know about All for One or a lot of the dangers out there in the world. Though with a quirk like his, Mirai didn't have the luxury of being so blind to the cruelty of the world. Feeling that he'd been cooped up in his office for too long, Mirai turned to his office's door and left the room, wandering the halls for a bit in an attempt to clear his head while he got some fresh air. After a few minutes of walking around, Mirai ended up on another level, the one that held large panels of glass for one of the outer walls, and Mirai pursed his lips at the sight of said glass. To say he was a fan of such an open layout would be underselling his distaste of it. However, the rest of the building was just fine, and he could rent the space out as temporary space for other offices once in a while. Approaching the windows, he looked down at the street. Any number of people down there going on with their lives as normal, with monsters that they had no clue about lurking under their very noses. Ignorance is bliss, as they say, he supposed. "Hey, yes, sir. There you are." A cheerful voice called for him, bringing him out of his own thoughts, and he turned around to look towards the voice and smiled. There at the other end of the hall was his young charge, Mirio, dressed in the workout clothes he'd recommended to the boy once he started training the boy, the young boy running up to him. "Hello, Mirio, has something happened? You weren't supposed to come by for." Mirai paused from his question to check the time with his watch. "Another half an hour," he said before placing his hands in his pockets. Mirio began to chuckle lightly as he rubbed the back of his neck, his eyes closed and a carefree smile on his face. A display that was bittersweet in its familiarity, having seen it time and time again from Toshinori. "Sorry, sir, but I wanted to show you the new uniform I got made. It was made from all the hair I got, so it'll stay on me when I'm training." Mirio told him, a bit flustered as he held up a bag in one of his hands. The boy standing in front of him, like a puppy waiting for Mirai's opinion. An image that was very fitting for the young boy, and Mirai reached out a hand to place on top of Mirio's head. I see. Well, then I suppose we should go down to spar. Mirai replied, moving to go to the elevator, Mirio practically bouncing after him. Mirai pressed the button before turning his attention back to his charge. How was class today, Mirio? Mirai asked, as he always did when Mirio visited him after a school day. Oh, they were all right. I mean, it's sort of weird, but like not in a bad way. My classmates keep to themselves more, but I mean, since we weren't all that close before the whole bucket thing, you know. Mirio said, fumbling a bit to explain what he was trying to say. Mirai nodded along with a smile on his face the entire time Mirio fumbled to tell him what he meant without it sounding rude about his classmates. One of many traits he'd learned that Mirio had shared with Toshinori, making their likeness go beyond just their appearance, and only reinforced Mirai's belief that Mirio deserved to be the next holder of One for All. Sure, Mirio was quite unsure of himself when he first came to Mirai for the internship, but he doubted any young boy would be 100% certain of anything at this point in their lives, bar the narcissistic. But Mirio's personality was only one half of the equation. As was his quirk, though, both things would be meaningless if the boy didn't have the proper drive of a true hero like Toshinori. Taking a moment to remember what the boy looked like when Mirai first saw him, he could see the broad-shouldered but otherwise meek boy with short hair anxiously looking up to him, awaiting his guidance. Then with this mental picture in his head, Mirai's eyes slid over to the boy, who moved to follow into the elevator, and who would have dwarfed his previous self with all of the muscle he'd managed to build up in less than a year. Having followed the exercise and dietary plan to the letter to achieve his current stature, a fact that spoke to the boy's determination, which was a very important thing for the next wielder to have in order to fight off All for One should they cross paths too early. And if Mirio kept it up like he hoped, then he'd be ready to accept One for All by the start of his third year, exactly as Mirai planned. Now the only question would be how he'd get Toshinori to listen to him long enough to come down and see Mirio. Mirai was quite certain that once Toshinori sat down with Mirio, he'd see just how perfect the boy would be as the ninth holder, and no doubt live up to the legacy of the quirk itself. What with Mirio being such an upstanding young man. Sir? Mirio called, staring at him, and Mirai hummed out of acknowledgement. Mirio looked down suddenly and rubbed the back of his neck, looking much more nervous and again adopting the stance of Toshinori, making reading the boy very easy to him. I know you said that building up my strength would help me in the long run, but, shouldn't I also be working on my flexibility too, and not just building muscle? Mirio asked hesitantly as he avoided Mirai's eyes. Mirai smiled, shaking his head. He could understand the boy being concerned about that, but it was a moot point with his quirk, especially with how One for All would evolve his quirk once it was transferred over to him. Mirai patted the boy's head. While keeping up your maneuverability is important, Mirio, it will not mean much if the few blows you land won't knock them out immediately. Shock and awe will be your greatest asset with a quirk like yours, Mirai assured Mirio. Besides, I took that into account when I made up those plans for you. Mirai added just as the elevator reached the floor that held the practice areas and stepped off the elevator. Mirai's additional comment clearly putting whatever worries the boy held to rest, and he continued to follow after him. The second part of his statement wasn't a complete lie. Mirai had put in a bit more stretches in the workout routine Toshinori told him he followed when he was Mirio's age and working on putting on pounds so the quirk wouldn't tear him apart. A regiment Mirio seemed to be taking to quite well, especially when one considered the boy had not put on a monstrous amount of weight despite the severe increase in caloric intake compared to the average human diet, of course. Truly, Mirai's gut instinct about the boy was spot on, and the only thing left to do was get back in contact with Toshinori and have his friend meet his little prodigy. Katsuki grumbled as he woke up to the sun in his eyes. Stupid gas ball. Katsuki pushed himself up from bed. He ran a hand through his hair and started walking over to his bathroom and took off his pajamas. Turning on the water in the shower, he jolted and immediately hissed at the chill, frowning at the sharpness of the cold water on his skin the entire time until he could get back out and feeling much more human than before. Waking up was the shittiest part of his day, caked in dry sweat from his quirks constantly pissing out more throughout the night. His folks bought him special sheets, so he didn't have to deal with being in a puddle of it on top of that, even if he had to remake his bed every morning. Speaking of, Katsuki grabbed his PJs off the floor and went back to his room, tossing the clothes in his basket, and started to strip his bed, the sheets and blanket quickly following the clothes into the basket as well. Then he went over to his drawer, and after some thought picked the black ones for today because it was the first one he could find and not the color of them that made him pick that set. Of course, it was not because he still hadn't looked at the messages the penguin duo left him since the day before yesterday. Absolutely nothing to do with them. Katsuki threw his pillow onto his bed with far too much force, causing it to land wrong, and he had to fix it so that it was rearranged to look right. Getting frustrated, Katsuki turned away and moved to grab his mini wheel and a glob of clay, dunking it in some water before crushing it in his hands. Pottery, surprisingly, was a great stress reliever since he could mash it all up and still end up with something worth a few bucks by the end of it. The fact it would be strong to F up was actually helpful to him to keep from stressing with the activity like he would other ones. Like cooking, he liked cooking, but the chance of F up was pretty high if he didn't wear the gloves and handkerchief his parents got him. Mainly because his sweat, even in small concentrations, could be dangerous if consumed by others. As it was for almost every other thing he did. Not for lack of trying out different CRP, but he had probably given up at some point since he was too focused on getting himself ready for UA. He painted when he was still in pre-K with Izuku, but painting was messy and most were combustible, so that would be more hassle than he wanted to deal with. Drawing was okay, but other than his and Izuku costumes, he didn't have much interest in it or any other form of art barring the clay stuff he was doing. Most physical SHD was also a no-brainer since his sweat was toxic and most sports had some form of contact or infuriating to him because of their rules. Hiking with the hag was nice though. Hell, he couldn't even think about touching someone without considering if they were wearing enough clothes to protect them from his sweat and if he could get away with a quick brush against them. He only got away with longer stuff with his folks because his old man's quirk left him safe for the most part, and the hag took meds to counteract the side effects in addition to her other meds. Annie took the meds too, and Izuku didn't need them since he could process the compound better. It just left him feeling hazier or out of it. Katsuki's thoughts were interrupted by his phone vibrating, and he flinched when it continued to vibrate until his phone kicked the call to his voicemail. He wasn't avoiding them. Katsuki just didn't want to talk with them right now, which was fully within his rights. If he didn't want to deal with them right now, then he didn't have to, and he did not feel guilty about it in any way, shape, or form. His ignoring the two had absolutely nothing to do with why he got up from his wheel and grabbed the bottle dye and the red and yellow glitter. Katsuki was not making a brand new piece for the two of them because of the fact he wasn't responding to the calls or messages. He was just making it because he wanted to. Adding the black dye, he carefully molded it so that the black didn't fully cover the gob of clay and shaped it until it looked like black deer with blue-gray socks and sprinkled the red glitter on top of it, painting white gaze on the deer to form spots and an underbelly. The second one was much larger solid black and a big rack before adding the yellow glitter and painted the tips of the antlers white, and put the one in his oven after cleaning his hands off, taking a big drink from one of his water bottles before settling down in front of it, moving his head side to side, cracking it before rolling his shoulders. Ready, Katsuki placed his hands in the slots on both sides of the oven and turned on his quirk. Small bangs filled the air with little puffs of smoke coming out of the top in a rush, being forced out of the oven. Seconds later, Katsuki opened the oven and examined the deer before nodding to himself that it looked all right and got the other one and repeated the process. With more booms to score the surface, adding a nice change in the regular black and the burn bits. Placing the two together, Katsuki couldn't help feeling prideful with his work as he wiped his hands clean again. A knock on his door left him to grunt in replay, his old man sticking his head in. "Busy morning, Katsuki?" his old man asked, and Katsuki nodded. "Well, breakfast is made. Feel free to come out when you get hungry," his old man offered. "Whatever, geezer," Katsuki replied, putting down the rag and walking to the door to get something to eat since he was feeling peckish. "Morning, Brad. Going on a hike after filling up? Do you want to come and burn off some energy?" the hag asked, pausing from eating her bowl of food. Katsuki considered it for a moment. He'd definitely like to get out of the house, but his nose scrunched up the thought. He liked stomping around the woods, especially since he always found cool SHD out there to add to his clay sculptures on top of a safe workout. But he didn't want to slather himself in sunscreen and bug spray today, or deal with the bonelessness afterwards. "Hell no. Ain't being bug bait for you, Beach," he told her, flipping her off, making her start spitting and hissing at him. repressing a grin when she did. Falling into one of their pissing matches for the next half hour, stretching out breakfast for much longer. Katsuki had missed this. It helped relieve some of the tension when he could have these spats with her, and there were never any strong feelings by the end of it because people talk CRP all of the time. Returning to his room, Katsuki grabbed up his laundry basket and headed for the bathroom to clean it up, pouring his and his old man's detergent in and a handful of those Orby things which work together to make their sweat a non-threat. With nothing to do, Katsuki went back to his room and got started on his homework and studying, which he must have been pretty sucked into it for him not to notice how much time had passed afterwards. Katsuki did notice, however, when one of the two birds broke into his room and tackled him in a hug. "Bakugu," said Shadow Bird, chirped in his ear and took advantage of his shock to nuzzle him. "Potty, what the F are you doing here?" Katsuki questioned, pushing the shadow off of him. "Fumi and I are here to kidnap you," Potty cheerfully answered. Asterisk the F, asterisk Katsuki thought, one of his eyes twitching as the shadow's twin entered his room. "Apologizes, Bakugu. I tried to talk them out of this, but Suddy was insistent," Patchy said, covering his face with one hand and looked bashful about the whole thing. "The F that's supposed to me, mother F, Before Katsuki could properly interrogate Patchy, Potty wrapped himself around him to the point he couldn't move and only watch as he was dragged out to the living room. "Thanks for letting us kidnap your son, Bakuga-san. We'll have him back by 9. Potty told his old man, while Patchy buried his face in his hands, hissing at his F-twin that was still holding him captive. "Have fun and stay out of trouble, boys," his old man replied, not doing anything to stop the two penguins from taking him out of the house. Traitorous BSTRD. It was only after they were all outside the apartment did Potty let him go, and he immediately rounded on the two and grabbed Patchy by the collar. "The hell do you two think you're doing?" he spat at them. Patchy gave an alarmed chirp, hands flying up in surrender. "There's a festival, and Suddy insisted that we should bring you despite your lack of an answer to us asking you to come," Patchy told him, at which point Potty hugged him again, making him let go of Patchy's collar. "Because Bakugu clearly needs a day out and to have some fun. So come on, Bakugu, or we'll miss our train," Potty confirmed, somehow dragging him and Patchy off without letting either of them get a word in. And despite his protests, Katsuki, totally against his will, mind you, was forced on a train and found himself standing beside Patchy and the physical bird paid for their entrance to some Inuyama festival. The only reason he hadn't punched them in the face was because unless he used his quirk, then the Shadow Penguin wouldn't even feel it, and Katsuki wasn't going to get himself a record for either of those dumbasses. "Look, they're selling kimonos over there. Fumi, we need to get one for you," Potty exclaimed, pointing to one of the booths at the entrance. Oh, and one for Bakuga too. "He looks so cute in this one, Fumi," Potty continued to say as they held up one of the kimonos, one that was black with gold trim and red feather details stitched into the cloth. "Suddy," Patchy hissed, feathers ruffled and trying but failing to hush his excited twin, of whom was determined to find a kimono for Patchy that wouldn't clash with the one they had picked for Katsuki himself. For F's sake, you'd think this is their first bloody festival with the way they're acting. Katsuki grumbled and Patchy flinched. "It kind of is," Patchy told him, and he stared at the bird with a what the F face. Patchy ducked his head and crossed his arms. Suddy wasn't allowed out in public like this. Being officially a familiar quirk, now we could file for a permit and they could be let out of me up to 3 meters around me legally. So this is their first festival, Bakuga, Patchy explained to him. Katsuki grumbled under his breath and pinched the bridge of his nose. Of course, that was why Patchy's backbone was on sabbatical at the moment. "Look at this one, Fumi, it's perfect," Potty said, coming back with a dark red one with black trim and a yellow band. "Thank you, Suddy," Patchy said after a moment, taking the kimono and checked the price tag and winced at it. Looking between the two, Katsuki, though irritated, didn't feel the need to leave, and after cursing himself out for it in his mind, snatched up both of the kimonos and went over to pay for them. Wasn't like he used his pocket money for much, and he didn't need to save up for helping Izuku like he was before. He did not feel vindicated for doing it when Potty let out a series of thankful chirps, and nuzzling him again even more, he just pushed the bird off him and went to put on his kimono in one of the available booths. Slipping into the kimono, Katsuki, begrudgingly, had to give Potty some credit in picking one of nicer ones that actually felt soft against his skin, so at least he wouldn't have to deal with wearing some half-assed, itchy SHD for the next hour. Katsuki was grabbed as soon as he came out by Potty, and he was dragged around with Patchy to the other booths, letting Potty coo at all the cheap SHD that was normally found at these places. It was annoying but bearable for the most part, as long as the shadow penguin didn't stick the barbecued mice on a stick he bought for them in his face. Then he was almost tackled by a big but lab, and he immediately started cursing as he reeled back. "I'm so sorry, Dash," the man walking him tried to say, but Katsuki flipped him off. "I don't give a flying F, keep your rapid mutt on a leash, or go the F home. Spineless, see?" Katsuki hissed, quickly stomping off from the main area and away from the demon dog. The flightless birds found him still fuming under a tree a few seconds later. "Bakugo, are you all right?" Patchy asked first, and Potty surprisingly followed up with, "Do you need to go home?" Katsuki scared, avoiding looking at them, as if some dumb mutt would F me up that bad. He snapped back. Potty moved to hover into his view. "Are you sure? It's okay to go back early. We could just hang out in your room and watch you make more clay stuff or blow up some more anger dolls," Potty suggested, and Katsuki scowled at that. "We ain't ditching. I just F." Katsuki spat back before turning away from them both with his arms crossed. "Was it the dog?" Patchy hesitantly asked, walking over to his side. "No, yes, screw you." Katsuki hissed back with no real fire behind the words. "Are you allergic or something?" Potty inquired softly, and Katsuki shot him a look. "Are you kidding me, dumbass? My sweat is basically poisoned to the point where I can't touch people for long without sending them to the hospital. That suicidal mutt would have been dead in minutes if it licked me, cause animals handle it even worse than humans, do you moron?" Katsuki exclaimed, letting off a couple small pops from his hands. "Oh," Potty squeaked back, "so you've never had a pet before?" Potty asked, and Katsuki rolled his eyes, pinching the bridge of his nose. "And just what kind of pet could I get where I wouldn't get in contact with it or its food?" Katsuki sassed back. "Right, do you want to go back now, Bakugo?" Potty asked, and Katsuki just nodded, walking back into the line of booths. Walking around for a bit, Katsuki calming down from the animal scare, though he kept a more weary eye out just in case. "Fumi, look, we have to play that one now," Potty insisted, pointing to a random booth, and dragged Patchy off. Katsuki grumbled, shaking his head, and followed the two penguins over to whatever booth Potty wanted to check out now, only to frown confused as he stared at game stand with a bunch of fish in glass bowls and a balloon dart wall. What the hell about this stand that got Potty's attention? Did he want to eat one of the fish? He didn't care much either way, and watched as Patchy tried his best to get 3 out of 5 of the balloons, just barely managing, and Potty cheered. "All right, kids, which one do you want?" the lady behind the counter asked, and Potty rushed to grab one of the bowls, proudly revealing the yellow fish with red spots all over its fan-like tail before offering it to Katsuki. "Potty, the F are you doing?" he questioned. Meanwhile, Potty proudly puffed himself up. "This, Bakugo, is a pet you won't have to touch and can use gloves to handle its care. And bettas like this are super hardy, cute, and aggressive, just like you," Potty told him, placing the bowl in his hands while his brain blew a fuse. "Suddy, they're going to release the lanterns soon?" Patchy commented, and before Katsuki could deny keeping the stupid fish, Potty was dragging them all over to watch the line tree floats as they released the multiple lanterns. "Bakugo, look at how pretty they all are," Potty chirped, hugged him from the side, and nuzzling him. Katsuki stared at the shadow being clinging to him, who decided to kidnap him for the day, and sked. "Just a bunch of fireball muppet face," Katsuki huffily replied. And Potty chirped again in a twittering laugh of sorts. "That's why I like them. They're just like your quirk," Potty said. "F you," Katsuki spat back. "Thank you for joining us on this journey through What If Villain Deku Became a Teacher at U.A. We hope you found it as captivating as we did. A big thank you to Bloomerbill for creating such an engaging story. Don't forget to visit their profile on fanfiction.net for more fantastic works. The link is in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Zenin Fanfics for more intriguing explorations into fanfiction and fantasy. Your support helps us create more content like this, and we love hearing your thoughts and suggestions in the comment section. See you soon in the next video.